que la vérité touche au réel.
Young Jacquians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia, Isabel Millar.
Engaging the unconscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
All right, I guess I'll lead us off. All right, what is going on, everybody? It is Kevoy, or as we should announce our new name, which is the Vanishing Mediators. Today we have a special guest. We have the privilege to talk to Isabel Millar on psychoanalysis and AI. So this is going to be a great conversation. Isabel, why don't you give a kindly introduction about yourself and the work that you do, both in the text and any previous past works or current works that you're doing right now?
Sure. Hi guys, it's really nice to speak to you over the airwaves. So I mean, I wrote this book, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. I can't even remember the name of the book. It was a few years ago now, so I feel like I've spoken about it so many times that I probably can't even remember what I said. But it's a very good book, apparently. So no, I'm joking. So this was my PhD thesis, and I published it in 2021. And as the title suggests, it's a sort of a provocation between the field of psychoanalysis and the conceptual terrain of artificial intelligence. I'm a philosopher. My background is in sort of continental thought and, of course, in psychoanalysis. And my PhD was kind of grew out of a sort of series of interests, both in sort of critical theory and then more specifically in the clinical psychoanalytic texts that I was reading and getting more involved with, because when I did my master's, I was sort of being taught Lacanian psychoanalysis by practicing clinicians. So I kind of got a different way into thinking about much of the sort of Lacanian literature than perhaps the traditional way that you might come into it via literary studies or philosophy. So it was much more kind of concerned with the body, concerned with the symptomology, concerned with actual cultural phenomena that was happening and changing in the actual physical world, as it were. So it's kind of like I was struck by a certain gap in the literature, as it were, and gap in the sort of conceptual literature around how to think about some of the sort of genealogical shifts conceptually, along with kind of current affairs, if you like, what's actually happening, how are people responding to the world, how are people feeling about their bodies, and how is this something that we need to think about philosophically. So with those two kind of interests, developed this general idea about putting together psychoanalysis and AI because of the whole sort of climate around people talking about AI as the new thing we have to worry about as a human race. And I found that there was like so much bullshit that people were talking about that just sounded philosophical, sounded big ideas, but actually didn't have any of the real stakes that, of course, people who work in psychoanalysis and philosophy are really interested in. So that was the starting point. Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. And one thing that's good to point out is that I think I even make the mistake of saying saying that your work is called Psychoanalysis and AI, but it's Psychoanalysis of AI, which is very interesting. And I think you pointed that out with your conversation with Cadell last, which was really good. And one thing about this text is very rich in, like you said, continental philosophy, and from the framework of the Kantian questions of what can I know, what can I hope for, etc. And one thing that I find interesting about this is, like, when you look at this compared to, let's say, what was going on in the philosophical tradition, and especially like in the US with John Searle, and trying to combat against AI with, like, what was it, the Chinese room experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get other people like Hubert Dreyfus, doubling down on it with phenomenology, saying that, like, computers can't be human, or like, you know, don't have brains. And it seems like they're tackling this from the sort of presupposition of seeing humans on this speculative terrain, and only seeing it from maybe an analytic tradition, or even from the sense of phenomenological experiences, which, don't get me wrong, they're not in the field of psychoanalysis. But what psychoanalysis does is kind of, again, what the Freudian Copernican revolution shows, is that we're not the masters of our own house. And so it puts into question not about, you know, what can I just hope for, what can I know, but as you say, how can I enjoy, or can an AI enjoy, which is something that is kind of concealed by the scientific discourse that's either pro AI or against AI, and even the philosophical tradition that's very reactionary against, you know, machines or artificial intelligence having a sort of supremacy over, you could say, the Anthropocene, or what we hope to figure out about ourselves in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think the main thing, to put it clearly, is the notion of jouissance and sexuality.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I suppose that's the sort of central concept that I sort of use to frame the whole text is, of course, the jouissance, and specifically the sexual non-rapport in Lacanian terms. And as you say, I use the sort of traditional philosophical Kantian questions: what can I know? What should I do? What may I hope for? I.e., you know, the sort of epistemological, the ethical, and the sort of theological, in inverted commas, concerns, to sort of frame the way that we want to approach this question, except, of course, with the caveat that I do it with the sort of psychoanalytic subversion, which is to not approach the question straight on in the Kantian sense, but to approach them as it were in the Lacanian way, and not try to answer it in the standard sense, but try to position the subject within the question, and see how we can think about the relationship between truth and knowledge within these questions. And of course, this is why it's a good way to think about psychoanalysis as being an anti-philosophy, which of course I go into in the book, specifically what that means for respect to Lacan's work, because it's not a simple rejection of philosophy itself, but it's an interrogation, it's formal structure, a sort of an investigation into the sort of new scientific revolution that Lacan was interested in looking at all the different disciplines that actually have to go into psychoanalytic thought, and in a sense undermine a lot of philosophical discourses from before. That's to say, linguistics, topology, mathematical logic. And, you know, he was interested in how all of these new sciences, as it were, have to also be incorporated into the way that we approach the question of the conscious subject, the thinking subject, and of course, more specifically, the speaking subject, because essentially what Lacan is interested in is not just language, but speech, and the fact that speech comes from this very particular meeting of a biological body in a system of dead signs. And that's what human beings are, is this strange meeting point between biology and the undead. So from there, you get this whole new way of trying to understand what subjectivity is with you know the sort of psychoanalytic revolution. So yeah, so the sort of Kantian questions serve to kind of frame the sort of movement of the debate in the book, and sort of go through various different transitions to unpack what different ways can we ask these questions, these epistemological, ethical questions, etc.
Right. And I think one thing just to kind of comment on is when you mentioned anti-philosophy. So for Lacan, anti-philosophy is a rejection of philosophy itself, but as you said, kind of interrogating the formal structure of it, and in so doing, what he's essentially trying to get at is to bring that interrogation within the other sciences and other schools of thought like structuralism, cybernetics, etc. Is that that correct?
Yeah. So I mean, the the actual idea of anti-philosophy can be traced through various different movements in Lacan's thinking, and he doesn't go into great detail about himself being an anti-philosopher. I think he only says it in one text.
It's mainly Badiou that calls himself
exactly.
Yeah.
He puts him in this lineage of anti-philosophers, but within Lacan's work, you can attribute various different ideas to this kind of general idea of anti-philosophy, and one of them, for example, would be the sort of Kojèvian idea to do with the extraction of knowledge. So the idea of the transition from the technical knowledge to the sort of episteme of forms of formal rationality, so sort of instrumental rationality. So he uses the example of the slave boy in Meno, with him being told to like draw shapes on the sand, and then of course the slave master is extracting a sort of system of knowledge from this human body, but the human body of the slave doesn't know what it's doing. It's just technically materially contributing to knowledge. So this idea of extraction is a theme, of course, that Lacan will use in relation to Kojève to think about what anti-philosophy might mean there. Then, of course, he moves to other questions as well to do with the sorts of claims that philosophers are prone to make in relation to this sort of sleight of hand between thinking and being, because Lacan has this big thing about the crucial sort of the crucial move for philosophy is to assume that thinking and being are the same thing. And he's a bit like, why would that be? You're forgetting something, which is language. Language, we only are subjects by virtue of the fact that we speak. And as soon as we actually start to speak, in a sense, for Lacan, we lose being, because being is the thing that we just are as sort of these blobs of something or other that then have to come into existence. So existence is this word that actually has within it a sort of clue to what it's about. It's a sort of extraction, it's a being outside of oneself. So as soon as the moment you enter into language, castration, you move from being to existence. So you have to give up being to exist. And that kind of sounds all a bit like weird and metaphysical, but actually it's quite technical. It's just simply to do with the fact that the system of abstraction, which is language, inevitably involves this sort of negation and this loss of something. So that's one way of thinking about anti-philosophy, and essentially it comes down to this sort of, or Badiou, as he sums it up, it's to do with the sort of the imbecilities of philosophy, of the fact that it's to do with jouissance, it's to do with enjoyment, and ultimately the non-rapport. And then we get into the whole question of the structure of sexuation and language as structure itself.
And I think at one point you say, apropos of that, the imbecilities, that the chain of S2s, the production of knowledge, is not the same thing as philosophy itself. I thought that was a really keen point you made. I wanted to ask you about, I really liked how you periodize the 6 paradigms of jouissance. To me, that the best breakdown of that I've found, and you rely on Jacques Millar to help unpack those and do it all in the service of presenting this 7th hypothetical paradigm of jouissance that pertains to the sex bot. Can you explain a little bit about what your conception of this 7th paradigm would be?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because that was the question that Lorenzo Chiesa asked me in my Viva, and I was like, shit, I don't know what it is. So the 7th paradigm, it comes about because, of course, in the book I talk about Jacqueline Millar's way of elaborating these 6 paradigms that he sort of draws from Lacan's work, and them ending with the non-rapport. So I think it's the imaginarization, the signification, real jouissance, which is normal jouissance, impossible jouissance, discursive jouissance, and then non-rapport. So he sees that there's different ways of conceptualizing the question of jouissance throughout Lacan's seminars, which have slightly different emphases, which essentially move back and forth, but it's not like as if each one replaces the next, but it's more like a sort of genealogical tracing. And I think it's really useful to kind of think about the concept of jouissance as something which has various different conceptual movements, because it helps us to be a bit more specific, rather than, oh yeah, jouissance is just this weird concept that can do anything. And actually it's like it's better to think of it as different ways of trying to come up with a sort of adequate description of human suffering in a way. How do you get to grips with this weird creature who has to deal with itself? So when we get to the end of, I suppose, the six paradigms, we actually, the non-rapport, it's kind of like this impasse, because of course by definition you have the impasse of the non-rapport. Okay, the sexuality is essentially the thing that defines all human beings, and we're all kind of marked by this problematic, and which is good and fine, and we could leave it there. But I suppose with this book, what I was interested in is trying to think about how artificial intelligence problematizes our always already problematic relationship to sexuality. So it allows us to see for what it is, the very, very difficult fact that we are sexuated beings, and that we can't just simply replicate ourselves or get rid of our bodies or get rid of our brains, because there's something that is a bit more speculative than that needs to be thought about. So the seventh paradigm comes about by trying to open up the question of, is there some other problem that happens when artificial intelligence, speculatively speaking, becomes an actual conceptual issue for us? Because at the moment we only have it in fiction, so we only have these problems really in film. We think about them as possibilities, and that's why in the book I examine lots of films that envisage different forms of artificially intelligent beings and bodies, both sort of disembodied and sort of in human form. And I kind of have touched upon some of the problems that it brings up, to do with ultimately, of course, the question of reproduction, but also the question of motherhood and fatherhood, and what is a mother and what is a father, which are very psychoanalytic questions. And ultimately we come to the problems of the original problems of psychoanalysis, which are the intractable problems of humanity. What was before us, and how can we imagine after our death or before our death? And that's essentially what psychoanalysis gets to, is these impasses that we don't have answers for, which then set off the whole kind of series of symptoms that plague us forever and ever. So there's various other ways that this seventh paradigm comes in to do with, of course, things related to the Lathus, which we spoke about with Cadell and stuff, to do with the drive, and to do with what happens when you tamper with the drive and the body in ways that artificial intelligence is now making possible, and of course neuroscience as well. And how do these other questions complexify what is already a very difficult question of jouissance?
Yeah, I really liked how you took the time and effort to define all of these paradigms, because it seems like too often a lot of Lacanians, of course, throw around this word, jouissance, expect their audience, their reader, to know which meaning they're referring to. But like you said, it's sort of all of the meanings are successively preserved and sort of nested in each other. So yeah, kudos to you for that. Can we talk a little bit about this idea of, was it technics? I think you alluded to it before with Meno, the slave boy, this extraction of knowledge. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a sort of collective memory we're talking about, and the different technological modes of storing that memory over time, and how, of course, artificial intelligence throws a monkey wrench into that entire process.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like the one of the thinkers who sadly passed away, Bernard Stiegler, one of the thinkers who I engaged with a little bit in this book with about this question. His work is really useful for thinking about this question of the sort of difference between techne and episteme, and how when thinking about something like this monolithic question of artificial intelligence, it can often seem like it's this new question that's just, entering the field of philosophy, and that we now suddenly have a whole new set of problems. But actually, it's a very old problem. The question of extraction of knowledge, the question of computation, the question of instrumental rationality are philosophical concerns that have, a very, very long history. And once you start thinking about this problem on a much sort of longer, deep historical scale, you see that it's not as simple as just thinking about like, oh no, now humans have to deal with the way that our knowledge is technologically extracted. I mean, we've been doing this for thousands of years. So to trace back where it started, when did we first start extracting cultural memory? You'd have to start going back to when we first started burying the dead, when we first started writing things on walls, when we first started signaling anything, when language eventually started. And then if you want to go further back before then, we have to think about evolution of animals and how they develop different limbs in order to facilitate them to do different things. So this idea of the sort of technological extraction of knowledge is something that has so many layers within it, and can be, obviously, you can think about in the sort of Frankfurt School sense of instrumental rationality, and how to think about this relationship between enlightenment in general. But you can also think about it in terms of the relationship between the kind of early human and how he dealt with his forms of extraction. And that can get very Bataillean, for example, thinking about expenditure, thinking about how we even deal with all of this kind of this exchange of energy that we have to have as civilizations to carry on to the next level of culture, as it were. So once I started to try and think about that problem, I was like, oh my God, it's like there's too much already to think about. And hence I see it more of like an opening up of a field. There's a field of thought here that is much greater than certainly what I can do in one book. And I think that it requires going back to classical philosophy, but it also requires psychoanalysis, it requires critical theory, it requires lots of different tools to think about the way that the human body interacts with systems, and how at the moment we're at this very like obvious stage where it seems to be a sort of watershed where it's like, oh well, we've got ChatGPT, for example, and this is a complete extraction of human knowledge. It's completely different from anything we've seen before. But in a way, it's not really. It's just showing us already how language systems work, how algorithms work. And humans are very algorithmic anyway. The way that we pick up patterns of language and the way that we reproduce certain tropes and cliches, and don't even interrogate what those cliches are or what those inherited forms of sort of in a Foucauldian sense, sort of like epistemes of knowledge. These are sort of all kind of algorithms in a way that we just regurgitate. So in a sense, these kind of machines that can show us how we do that. And then we turn around and go, oh, but you're not even thinking, you're just a machine. It's like, well, but that's actually how human knowledge works anyway. You know, we reproduce these kinds of patterns of knowledge all the time.
That's very interesting. And like right now, Nick and I are finishing up for our channel seminar too. So the symbolic order for Lacan is compared to like a machine.
Cybernetics as well.
Yeah, and cybernetics as well. And that what makes like the symbolic order a machine for us is that it's constantly breaking down, but then like there's a very productive process to it. It seems like in the sense that you were saying that how, you know, we're very much algorithmic. It's like what Matthew Fleecefader talks about as algorithmic desire. Would you say that that sort of way that we are sort of becoming algorithmic with our own enjoyment, our own desire, whether it be like on social media, on Amazon, etc., like getting what we want, is a sort of variation of the Lathus concept, or an example, not a variation, an example, like incarnated.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we're in sort of Deleuzean terms, you know, we're desiring machines. We are sort of perpetually going after desires, and in a sense a lot of those are sort of examined. They're not even things that we necessarily think that we want, but we just go for them and perpetually repeat certain desires. And of course we can think about that in physical terms, and sort of in the very sort of crude sense of, you know, drive, bodily needs, whether it's food or sex or whatever, but also intellectually, you know, we go after certain ideas and certain ideas of things that we want. But then as humans, it's sort of assumed that this is a sort of easy natural relationship and we should just give into it. But, you know, part of the sort of history of philosophy, and of course theology as well, is to do with the negotiation of how to deal with these, what we think are our desires, and whether they're right to want them or whether there is some other better form of mediating these desires. So, you know, part of the sort of questions of classical philosophy was, you know, what is the good life? What is it to lead the right sort of life? What is it to pursue knowledge, or to pursue happiness, or pursue, you know, and now of course the culture that we're in is about just having a good time and enjoying yourself, and of course making loads of money and achieving being the best person you can be, and all of the kinds of impulses that culture tells us is what we're supposed to want. You don't have to look very far to go, I'm not sure that this is very edifying for human beings, you know. And of course the obvious one to say is porn. You know, the obvious one is pornography. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's something now that young people grow up with. It's a sort of not even a choice, I don't think, for young people anymore. It's something that they have and they have to have. And now, as we know, it's very disturbing for a lot of young people to have grown up with. So in a sense, sort of pornography is a kind of archetype for the wider way in which our culture is just stuffs us with things. It was like, you want this is what you enjoy. And actually this stuffing with enjoyment is really troublesome and torturous in a sense. You know, it's horrible. It's a horrible thing to be stuffed with jouissance. And of course, you know, you might say, well, but that's only rich people, that's only people who are on porn sites all day. Well, no, the everybody, we're all kind of under this same injunction in different ways. And the question is, how do you kind of mediate this this circuit between trying to formulate a desire and getting it or satisfying it? And that's the space of psychoanalysis, in a sense. That's the space where psychoanalysis kind of tries to slow down that short circuit and go, okay, where is the subject in this? And what is your desire, and what is it about your desire that troubles you? And, you know, is there a different desire that maybe would be less ravishing for you? So, yeah, I mean, but of course, this is a sort of clinical question of psychoanalysis. And we don't have to talk about the clinic in, you know, only very few people actually get to go to the clinic or be in psychoanalysis. But the question of psychoanalysis as a intellectual space exists in this terrain.
Right. That's very interesting. I think one thing I find interesting on your last thing I'll say on your take about the way pornography functions, and actually that's what, you know, modern culture is kind of, you could say, constitutive by, like, of course, sexuality and libido is already constitutive via the symbolic order. I think it's like Darian Lear who also kind of cracks down on this, but the way you described it kind of shows how it's really validating Freud's early theory of seduction and how Laplanche takes it up. And Zizek talks about this in the parallax view, about like the antinomy of it being just a pure fantasy or an actual encounter of the other seducing the child, and thus being the what's the term, the admission into the symbolic order to develop one's sexuality. And it takes the form of the other being the algorithm in, you know, the guise of pornography and such. So I don't know, I'm just spitballing right there, but I kind of see that kind of validating the whole Freudian theory of seduction. I want to know about that.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, within psychoanalysis, the sort of the transition supposedly from Freud's time to our time, as it were, is marked by a sort of movement from, as it were, repression to sort of instigation. And so in Freud's time, the archetypal woman was the sort of repressed and hysteric woman. And, you know, so we were a very neurotic society that supposedly had to hide all of our libidinal urges. And for Freud, this was bad and should be mediated, and we needed to find some way of dealing with our discontents better for a better civilization, as it were. And to talk about the way that now the clinic thinks about this shift towards what was called ordinary psychosis in the 90s, this idea that there is a movement towards a binary clinic, towards a continuous clinic, which has something to do with the position of enjoyment, which has something to do with the position of the changing position of negation, as it were, whether we're talking about foreclosure or disavowal or repression. And that this movement in culture has a knock-on effect on the way that the clinic sees these different symptomatologies coming through the door. So what does this mean in real terms? It's like, well, there's something happening on the level of enjoyment that changes the way that we experience our bodies and changes the way that we experience sexuality, subjectivity, and translates into real physical effects. And of course it's very complicated to generalize over the whole of civilization. You can't just make a generalization about different civilizations and sexuality, because of course now today we have such divergent shifts within different parts of the world of how we view sexuality. But clearly different parts of the world react to the lifting of repression in different ways, and we get lots of extremes. And, you know, as we can see in different parts of the world today, we're getting homosexuality being banned again, for example, in Uganda, which happened very recently. So, you know, the lifting of repression also has its opposite effects in different parts of the world. But clearly this is the abiding thing that, you know, we can't forget Freud, because Freud was basically saying, you know, this is the key thing that we have to think about in civilization is how we deal with libido, how we deal with the fact that we are beings who are born into this strange exchange of desire and want and need, etc., etc. So this problem is it's not getting any easier, put it that way. It's not getting easier just because supposedly we're more free and easy about sexuality. It's probably getting even more complicated.
Yeah, I think you quote Alenka Supancic, who says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that, the human being is the point at which nature encounters its own deadlock, its own impossibility. And it seems as if, AI in many ways redoubles an already very difficult situation in which we find ourselves ontologically.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to ask you if, speaking of, Jacques Millar and these matters of the body, the way the clinic's approach to treating patients changed over time because of the development of, let's say, social symptoms, the way society itself changed, and the way some of the classical tropes of psychoanalysis, Lacan felt, didn't have the same efficacy as before. Name of the Father, Oedipus, those ideas. So he introduces, of course, this notion of the symptom, and the Borromean knot there is sort of knots the body in many idiosyncratic ways. And this sort of clinic of the symptom is something you talk about. But would you say you agree with Millar's thesis that society is dealing with a kind of generalized foreclosure and that we've become islands of enjoyment in that sense, or is that going too far?
Yeah, it's difficult because I think there are really important theoretical contributions and sort of conceptual changes that Millar is responsible for, and I think certainly this rethinking of the binary clinic from sort of a generalized into a generalized foreclosure, which of course he extracts from later Lacan and his engagement with James Joyce and the idea of the sort of the real taking precedence and the question of sort of how to deal with your suffering in a more constructive way. I think that this shift really helps us to think about what is at stake with our relationship to language, and the way that the question of the psychotic is sort of depathologized, certainly by Lacan, but even more so, I would say, in the later work and certainly in the Millarian clinic. I think that's one of the very important contributions, is this sort of destigmatizing of the question of psychosis, and the idea that actually what it helps us to understand, not just clinically but philosophically, is the fact that when thinking about these categories of madness or sanity, you immediately fall into sort of very broad strokes of fitting or not fitting into a norm. And of course, what psychoanalysis doesn't want to do is think about norms. It wants to think about singularities. And so when you start to think about, rather than madness or sanity, you think about structure. You think about, how does a person relate to language, and what function does language fulfill for them in giving a sense of reality to their universe, the question of foreclosure is a very useful concept because it helps to understand lots of phenomena that that people experience when they're going through certain mental troubles, as it were, rather than thinking about it like, oh, that person's psychotic, they've lost their mind, they're a lunatic. What are we actually talking about? So the way to kind of to sort of enrich this concept is to think about how is the body implicated in this situation, and where does the object sit with this person. So it's important, you know, to think about, for example, without going to crazy theorizations about people having psychotic breakdowns or anything, to think about in relation to depression and melancholia. Stein Van Herland, Derek Hook just recently wrote a book about that, but the idea of for depression and melancholia, the difference being the position of the object, so that in depression, which is traditionally a neurotic problem, the object is on the side of the other. It's something that the other person has, and it's therefore sort of still a sort of position of desiring something that you don't have. Whereas for the melancholic, it's much more dire because the object is with them, and this object is not a good object. It's an object of waste, and they are that waste. They can't get rid of it. So simply by thinking about this movement of the object, you can kind of see that the stakes are quite different in how you approach different forms of suffering. And it's very useful to think about how to think about psychosis in that way. Already shifts a little bit of how we can start to think about lots of other different phenomena, lots of other different phenomena to do with addiction, to do with self-harm, to do with manias, and how you can start to understand a bit better somebody's relationship to their body via thinking about the position of the object in relation to language.
That was very interesting, and I actually just recently bought that book, so I'm slowly diving into Derek Hook's work on depression and melancholia. So as you said, like the melancholic, the object is within them, and because of that, it's the fact that they no longer can desire anymore, right? And so how would that relate to, in a sense, like this general foreclosure and its relation to artificial intelligence? Does this bring out the sort of paranoia that something like AI is going to destroy humanity or take over humanity, as if artificial intelligence isn't already like a mediation for humanity? Like literally we're using Zoom right now, little things like, social media, the algorithm, even just our phones in general. So it's like we're dependent on it, but the lack of desire because of the sort of, and I think it's Dwayne Rousseau thinks that we are in the stage of melancholia, if I'm not mistaken. But does this tie in with a general foreclosure as well? Are they kind of synonymous?
I mean, so the idea of the sort of one all alone, which is the sort of Millarian clinical idea of this sort of autistic jouissance, as it were, that you actually, there is no discursive relationship anymore. There is no other. It's just you and your body and your own singular way of suffering and experiencing that. And of course, within the clinic, this has a much more specific and particular way of having to understand this concept in relation to the course of the direction of a treatment. But more generally speaking, if we want to think about what could that mean on a more sort of sociological, cultural basis, I mean, young people growing up in a sort of very isolated and alienated situation where they're always on social media, where everything is mediated via apps or via other technological devices, and of course a sort of loss of intimacy that people are experiencing, and sort of fear of it. I think I certainly feel like in my lifetime, since when I was younger, coming to now, it's like you're so used to not being in the room with people, to not meeting up with people, to not phoning people. Everything is done via messages. And I think if I was a young person growing up in this now, it's a completely different experience of what it is to be a young person and what it is to experience yourself growing up as an adolescent, and having to mediate all of those difficult relationships and sexuality and identity and all of that stuff. So you can sort of lazily attribute this, I suppose, and say, well, now we're all sort of vaguely autistic and don't know how to process social signals and everything, but that would be a kind of pseudo application. But I do think that there is, of course, a relationship between our mediated existence and the different forms of symptomatology that we see. But I think it's more complicated than just saying, oh, social media equals this. I mean, it's to do with, of course, as for psychoanalysis, is always to do with your mum and dad. There's no way we can short circuit this very important question of the formative experience of being born into a already constituted family unit, and what that relationship is with your mother and your father, or whatever particular home situation you have. But this now, of course, is influenced by so many other factors, which is of course to do with screens as well. Young people are in front of screens from a much earlier age than they used to be. So there are many reasons why, for the clinic, they're interested in technology writ large. But I suppose that's not really my particular concern. Of course, I'm not a clinician, so I don't really deal with the sort of everyday nitty gritty of human beings, because human beings are boring. I want to think about sci-fi creatures and stuff like that.
Cats are more fun.
Exactly. Yeah.
Clinic of the cat.
The clinic of the cat is yet to come. We need it.
Are we at a point in time where we can't even really talk about desire like we once did? Is everything that we're describing, does it sort of culminate in this waning of desire? Like, is the Latouche concept, is it something like an object A, but that's more directly plugged into the drive? I'm sure I'm missing a lot of the nuances there to the concept, but just for the sake of simplicity, is that what it is? Or am I missing something?
No. I mean, you're not missing anything. I think well, if you're talking about the Latouche, I'm interested in that concept because it's a sort of undeveloped concept. So in this book, I kind of tentatively go towards my kind of way of thinking about it in relation to the drive body, and in relation to how we can think about the objects that fall from the body, the gaze and the voice, and how they are appropriated by technology, how they're appropriated by formal systems, and what implications that has for the human being, sort of this sort of imaginary gestalt of this so-called unified creature that we call the human being. So I'm interested in thinking about how we can sort of change the emphasis from this question of the object A as simply the sort of object cause of desire, to this question of the Latouche, which is this sort of problematic object which has sort of moved from the other to ourselves, as it were, and can be extracted and manipulated in various different ways, and what problems that could cause, which of course at the moment is more of a speculative problem, because we don't yet have Elon Musk's dream of Neuralink in fruition or anything like that, but it won't be long, and we're already having to grapple with so some of the implications of this, and it's going to get more and more complicated. So hence why I think it's important to already start to think about. And I think sort of my work at the moment, my next book that I'm working on at the moment, which I'm sort of quite interested in, going back to Baudrillard and Baudrillard's critique of Foucault, for example, it kind of gets to what you mentioned about, can we even talk about desire anymore, or is there something else? And you know, when Baudrillard was talking about Foucault, and in his book Forget Foucault, he was kind of saying, well, the problem with Foucault is that what he's trying to describe is already gone, and that's why he can describe it. That's why he can sort of formalize it and write it all down, which means that in a sense it's dead. So Baudrillard was trying to say, well, there's a problem, because it seems like we've already got rid of a certain episteme by the time we're able to recognize that it's here. So in a sense, I would say that when we're so obsessed with talking about desire and sex and enjoyment and, you know, the explosion of pornography, it's probably because it's already over. It's already dead. You know, like the fact that everybody's addicted to porn when they're 15, supposedly now, as all the headlines say, you know, it probably means that sex has already come to this point where it's no longer functioning. It's no longer what it was. We're trying to run after it and try to explain it, but we're already moving into something else, and we're already having to deal with new problems and new questions. So I think like it's useful to kind of move to some Baudrillardian concepts, like the idea of seduction. I think is very useful, this idea of seduction as sort of metaphysical concept as opposed to a sexual concept, and the idea of the sort of the retreat, you know, the world retreating from itself because it's become so obscene. You know, everything is so obscene, not just actually sexually, but knowledge is obscene. Everything is transparent. We can know everything. We can dismantle the human genome. We can, you know, manipulate every piece of data about human life, and then we can, you know, supposedly know the past and the future. So it's this kind of moment of like, well, how do you retreat from that? How do you find a space of occlusion to actually recognize what's happening?
I love that. Yeah, thanks for that. That was great. Well, while we have you here, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about Lacan, maybe a little bit about your experience with the clinic, learning the seminars, and maybe we could take advantage of the opportunity to get a little bit of advice, because listening to your Machinic Unconscious podcast episode, you mentioned that, you know, you're focused on a few seminars in particular. I think 17, that's your seminar.
20, yeah, I'll say 17, 20, yeah.
And you're saying, like, you know, this ambition to have a completely encyclopedic knowledge and grasp of the entire corpus, that's not your thing. Me and Andrew right now, we're like very piecemeal going through the entire seminar. I mean, we're not even a year in, so this is like a completely Promethean task that I don't know that the world will have frozen over by the time we finish it, theoretically. But I don't know if I even have like a question here, really. I just wanted to.
What do you mean? Is it worth it?
Is it worth it?
Is it
Yeah.
worth it? I mean, look, I think if you're going to read anything, it's as good as anything else. Like Lacan seminars, I mean, bloody hell, like you're not going to get much more interesting stuff. But I would say, just for the sake of sheer like time, I mean, look, everyone's different, but I would say seminar 3, 7, 11, 17, 20. Like if you had to have 5. But then you'd say, oh yeah, but what about seminar 8? You know, like what about seminar 6? 5. What about like seminar 5? Yeah, I mean, like, you know, okay, so transference is actually really important if you want to think about love, and if you want to think about love in a sort of systematic way in relation to psychoanalysis. That is actually an important seminar. But in terms of like the big concepts and, you know, the big movements, I think like I would even say 3 over 1 and 2. Like, yeah, because just the stakes of 3, I think, set up so much for later on. But yeah, so if you have to choose 5, then those are the 5. But then seminar 23 as well. But you don't have to read the whole of seminar 23 to get what the point of like the later clinic is, I would say, either. Yeah.
No, that's good. Yeah. And you know, I'm a big fan of 11, so I think 11 is like definitely in that must. You know, although like I really dedicated like almost a year with seminar 1, and I find it very fruitful in a sense for like the clinical aspect alone. But I think you could find more developed thinking in Lacan and like those other seminars, like you said, 3, 7, you know, 11, 17, 20. I actually have a more theoretical question with this specific work, because like one could say like, well, why psychoanalysis and Lacan with AI when you could have used like Deleuze and Guattari, especially with, you know, the machinic unconscious and desiring production, you know? So like, what did you find specifically in the framework of D&G and their sort of semiotics that was limiting to this work, and why you found Lacanian psychoanalysis and the mix of continental philosophy more important? And we could probably say, you know, jouissance is the main one, but are there any other limitations to the sort of materialism of D&G?
I mean, you know, I could have done this project with D&G and it would have been a completely different type of project. I mean, I started off much more D&G and Foucault than Lacan, and be more of them than I did Lacan when I started, and now it was the other way around. But I think what was limiting for me in my experience of the people who were using D&G, I won't say people, I will say the discourse, it didn't ask the questions that I thought were important or interesting about this particular question of sexuality and the body. But that's not to say that you couldn't ask those questions through D&G in a different way, and open up many other really interesting philosophical conceptual areas. And the thing is, what we have to remember is that Deleuze is a philosopher and Lacan is not a philosopher, you know, so they have very different stakes. And what's always, I think, important to think about is that Lacan was a psychoanalyst and he was dealing with a clinic, and he had actual human beings that he was talking to and was speaking about all through his seminars. So he was really interested in the speaking subject, and the stakes of Deleuze and Guattari's work is very different. You know, it operates on a different level, and I wouldn't say, oh, one's more useful or interesting. I just think that they're different. They answer different questions and they approach different topics, and I don't think you have to choose either. I think they are very important thinkers in different ways. But I do think, though, that there is some limitations to Deleuze and Guattari when it comes to the question of enjoyment. I do think that you do need the strictly psychoanalytic when it comes to enjoyment, and I don't think you can just throw it away, which is some people think what the point of D&G is like, oh, it gets rid of all of that old-fashioned crap, and it's like, well, actually you can't actually get rid of it. I'm afraid it's not going anywhere. It's still here. Like it's not going anywhere. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that's what I'll say.
No, right. And it's interesting because even though Deleuze was just a philosopher, like Guattari was a student under Lacan, and he started his own clinic. But like, it's weird how he didn't come to like various questions concerning jouissance or sexuality. And, you know, he gets rid of transversality. And, you know, it'd be hard to understand, like, if you were to put that framework to AI, if you would still get the questions concerning, you know, the sex bot, does it enjoy, you know, or jokingly, can an AI eat its own Dasein? That's nonsense. But you know, like, there is no subjectivity for them, right? It's just a multiplicity, and you know, it's just sexuality to them is just assemblage, right? It has
exactly.
It has no understanding of lack.
And to give you some institutional context, I actually swapped around my PhD quite a few times when I was trying to figure out where I wanted to go. And at one point, I went to Goldsmiths and was in what used to be the cultural studies unit, which was of course like the home of like the D&G stuff, and there was like loads of Guattarians and very interested in people interested in computation and AI, and so I thought, oh, this is a great place to be. But actually, I quickly discovered that it wasn't a good place to be, and the person who was going to supervise me was very hostile to Lacan. They were just like, oh no, don't even talk about that. And I was like, whoa, okay, what's going on here? It just seemed to be like this fashion thing, you know. It was like, what is fashionable to read, and it was this kind of like quite crude cyberpunk old-fashioned stuff. It just felt like people thinking that this was the coolest theory, so therefore this was the one we need to use, without actually thinking about, yeah, but is it useful, is it interesting, is it actually, and yeah, it just didn't hit the spot. So I left and I came back to Kingston, which has its very many drawbacks, but the reason why it was a great place to be at that time was that of course, we got CREMET, which is the Centre for Research in European Philosophy, a very strong research centre with lots of great people there. But also, we did have the Masters in Psychoanalysis, which has barely been seen in any institution, certainly in the UK, but it was taught by practicing psychoanalysts. And, you know, it just kind of gave this whole different dimension, as I mentioned in the conversation, to thinking about Lacan, and to reading the seminars, and to reading Akri, obviously, which had a sort of level of engagement that I think is very rare, and opened up a lot of other questions. So yeah, I would say that it's certainly to do with institutional hubs that you find different people willing to engage with Lacan or not.
Yeah, I envy you that experience. What we're doing right now is in lieu of access to those institutions, just, I would say, working through, but more of a stumbling through.
That's the only way. The only way. Yeah.
And yeah, whatever conclusions we draw for us will be canonical, but I'm sure, you know, if we were you know, to meet Jacques Millar or something, I'm sure he would disagree with everything we do.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It's like, I think that's, you know, what I also didn't say was that this is not that was not the be all and end all of engaging with psychoanalysis, because, you know, trust me, I'm sure a lot of Millarians who would be like, oh, this is rubbish. Don't, you know, I mean, I don't know why I did a really rubbish French accent there, but, you know, I think that don't get involved in any clique, basically. Like, there is no one way of doing Lacan, and anyone who thinks there is probably a bit deluded. And also, like, don't just follow everything that he said. Like, that, you know, it's obvious, isn't it, I suppose, but I think there's always like things that you can take from different sides, and I don't take any sides in that sense. Like I'll read stuff from Millar, and I'll read Zizek, and I'll read Soler, and I'll read, but like people have different insights, and you don't have to like be aligning with anyone. Of course, Millar has lots of problematic things about trans. There's all loads of reasons why you can't take everything that one person says, and
No, definitely. No. I do have something. So I watched that Megan movie the other day, and I found it really corny, but it made me think of the conversation with you and Cadell when you talked about the child and the image of the child, and how it like can be a sort of fetishization, and you see it in like Nietzsche's transformation and Zarathustra of like becoming child, and just how we were talking about earlier, like how technology today shaped us, and you get this reaction like, oh, it's affecting the kids, like kids aren't who they used to be, as if like there is this pure blank slate innocence to the child. It's like kids are mean. The kids were mean when I was growing up, but what made that Megan movie interesting is that like,
which movie? Sorry,
Megan, the one about the AI child, like a daughter or like a family gets killed in, I think, a car accident. The child survives,
right.
And lives with the mom's sister, and so she's a scientist in developmental technology, and creates this robot named Megan, which is like a perfect blonde innocent child that's supposed to be a friend, a sister, and even a caregiver for the child. It's supposed to replace the parents, but it's also funny because it's like the innocence and what a child's supposed to be takes materialization in this AI bot. So it kind of becomes very uncanny. And there's this Frankenstein moment because she does rebel and she starts murdering people, and then rebels against the creator. So it takes on the point, it's like, well, what is it to be a child? And even, the question of a woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I just found that very interesting because it just kind of undermines this notion of pure innocence of the child,
Yeah, I mean, exactly, like children can be pretty evil. I mean, the idea that they all inherently one way or the other is nonsense. I mean, they're whatever we make them, basically. That's the terrifying thing, isn't it? I mean, they can be wonderful and perfect, or they can be diabolically evil, unfortunately.
Do you think that your work with this work ties in with your essay on the bombshell and how AI can kind of bring that spectacle or semiotics of the bombshell into a sort of, again, contradiction with understanding human sexuality, etc. Is there a kind of connection between those two works?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the bombshell essay actually sort of forms part of a chapter in my next book, Party Politics, and so the ideas in this next book are sort of developed obviously from the AI book, but in that essay, I'm thinking about the face, and I'm thinking about the semiotics of beauty, but also of femininity, but more kind of specifically how the kind of standardization of the face is a sort of phenomenon that we're seeing more and more, and that kind of reaches this very strange level where we're not quite sure anymore what beauty is, because we get to this kind of like perfect medium of supposedly the harmony of what human features are supposed to look like, and then it sort of crosses over into this monstrous terrain where it's like, whoa, okay. And obviously we're always fascinated by looking at when people's plastic surgery has gone wrong, and vitriolically laughing at people who had too much lip filler or whatever, but actually that is something that is really fascinating to think about, this sort of perfection of the human form and the aesthetics of the human form, and at what point we will be able to kind of get rid of any contingency whatsoever in the way that human beings look, and create them supposedly in accordance with a sort of perfect medium, and what that means, and how that sort of changes this the notion of beauty itself. And of course, once you're talking about beauty, you're immediately talking about femininity, and you get into this very interesting realm, certainly when you're using sort of psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, of thinking about the concept of the woman, and what is this thing that we think of as being this perfect being that sort of exists in this impossible realm, and that we're sort of constantly trying to cultivate and perpetuate, whether that's on a individual level as women, but also as society, this sort of perpetual kind of putting up on a pedestal of the idea of the bombshell. What is this perfect beauty that we're always trying to achieve? And of course, in this essay, I'm using the example of Marilyn Monroe, but her as this kind of combustible object that is emblematic of the kind of what happens when the sort of Baudrillardian form of the symbolic of beauty turns in on itself and explodes in on itself. What happens then? And Marilyn Monroe was a sort of historical figure that stood in for so much that today is just everywhere, of how we deal with beauty and how women deal with their bodies in relation to beauty. So that I just thought that the image of Kim Kardashian and at the Met Ball, that Cooper and Taylor pointed out, of the black balaclava, is just it's a very powerful image. It's this kind of black hole of being sucked into this the perfect spot. How do you reach this perfect object A? So yeah, I'm interested in that, and this sort of ties into the wider question of patai politics as a question of the pursuit of enjoyment writ large.
Yeah, if I were gonna, I don't know, describe the predominant aesthetic today, it would just be like a kind of smoothness. It seems like people are aspiring to look like their Bitmoji.
Yeah.
I think it's disturbing but fascinating the way that also people are emulating the Instagram filter generated
Right.
of themselves in everyday life. So there's definitely something Baudrillardian there.
Right.
I haven't had enough Baudrillard to really situate that idea, but
absolutely, yeah. It's sort of that the real is more real than the there's kind of like this you leave the realm of reality, and then your fake self becomes the thing that you're trying to get back to, because that's the more real version of you. We have our Instagram is really us. We're not the uglier version at home, we're the Instagram version, and we want to make sure that is the version of us that we can preserve and yeah, I mean, like, that's a sort of instantiation of sort of the hyperreal for Baudrillard of it's already left the domain of reality, because we don't really relate to reality anymore. Reality doesn't have any effect. It's it is more real for us to be to have our mediated versions than our actual real versions.
Right. That's interesting though that you said that, Nick, about like the filters and the emojis. But like one thing that I find interesting about that too is like, it seems that, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, Isabel, but like with the bombshell and like how you use Marilyn Monroe as an example, it's like she seems to function as this sort of iconic and nostalgic figure of like femininity and beauty and like being classy, whereas like now the predominant aesthetic in social media and even pop culture is like, yeah, Kim, but also like Cardi B, Meg Thee Stallion, and like the newest one is like Ice Spice, and like with the Gen Xers, the boomers or whatever, they're like, oh, kids these days are just so raunchy and overly sexual, and just like, what happened to the good old days? But like, again, like when you look at like Marilyn Monroe, and especially like the Blonde movie, like it shows like, as you're saying, like the trauma that she went into and all the stuff that she had to deal with in you know, capitalist production, exploiting her femininity, her trauma, her sexuality. And so it's like that raunchiness has always existed, right? It's just taking on a new hyperreal form. And then like we use that as like a nostalgia to forget, like, no, like it's still going.
Exactly. It's true. I mean, the sort of idea of Marilyn as this very, you know, demure and beautiful, sort of angelic figure almost, and that's why people are so kind of horrified to see her degraded and treated horribly, which is horrible, of course, but it's sort of like it betrays the kind of horrible prejudices that we all have about, well, it's like, you know, if it were a different type of woman, if it were a woman who wasn't so classy and so delicate and demure, would it have been less horrible to see her sexualized, you know, because she's asking for it? You know, it's so there on the surface that people don't see that they're perpetuating these horrible stereotypes about how women are supposed to present their sexuality. And, you know, yes, now our sort of cultural figures of femininity are much more explicitly sexual, much more aggressively sexual, much more phallically sexual, you could say. And is that a good or bad thing? I mean, I would say, of course, you know, generally speaking, I'm Baudrillardian about it in the sense that I think all of human culture is fucked up and we're all doomed. So in that sense, yes, we're all moving towards a terrible, horrific apocalypse. But whether or not, you know, the fact that women are more sexually embracing this phallic sexuality, is that any more oppressive than 50 years ago? I don't particularly think so. I think what's important is that if you want to do that, you also have to have your dignity and your self-worth and your idea of where you fit into the economy of exchange, so that you can show all of the bits of you want to show, as long as you are aware of how this fits into the kind of wider discourses that are going on. So yeah, I mean, it's also the question of like phallic sexuality, isn't it? I mean, basically all sexuality, all actual displays of sexuality are phallic in that sense, in the sense that they pursue a certain logic of pursuit and conquer. So women and men do that in exactly the same way. Women are no less capable of it than men.
I think that also, you know, as thinkers who are interested in psychoanalysis and view sex through that lens, think of language as inherently sexual, if not sex itself, then just to go back to the contrast between what we think of as explicit sexuality today, in which like everything is out there, everything is exhibited, versus the kind of movies that Marilyn Monroe was in, and, you know, what was seen as, what was considered more tasteful at the time, were just like, you know, a kind of, I wouldn't call it raunchiness, but like leaving something to the imagination. But when you watch some of those movies, I mean, just apart from what we know happened to her in her life, it's just like when you watch some of those old movies, the references to sex and the way they, you know, maybe got around the censors or whatever, there are like innuendos and things that are even more disturbing to me, especially from the point of view of language as sex, right? It's not just, oh, here's this part of my body, it's out there, look at it. It's like, I don't know if that makes any sense, but
yeah, no, it does. Have you got an example of from?
No, I wish I did.
I know what you mean, but like I mean, it's, I don't know, like, I think that the kind of the argument to be made about, you know, less obscenity, more eroticism, you know, it's kind of sort of closing the stable doors. You know, you can't really go back to these previous forms of cultural displays of sex. I mean, that we're in a different time. We simply can't do that. But I do wonder, how do you sort of how do you recreate different forms of relation, social relation or sexual relation, when everything's already been traversed? You know, what happens after that? You know, what happens after the orgy, as Baudrillard would say? But that's a serious sort of philosophical question, isn't it? I mean, you can't go back in time. You can't unknow things. And this kind of question of knowledge is actually really what I was really interested in this book, because the question of knowledge, of knowing too much, you know, this sort of biblical idea of the original knowledge of sexuality, as it were, is something that I think is right at the crux of our relationship to building other forms of knowledge or building other forms of life or whatever in the domain of artificial intelligence. Because it's like what we're so fascinated in when it comes to sort of sexual intercourse or sexual relationships is this encounter with the other person's jouissance, the other person's mind. And you know, of course, what I talk about in the book about the masculine and feminine forms of missed encounter in relation to things like ex machina and the Turing test, etc., I think is really so interesting to think about in relation to how you imagine what the sexual act is. Because as Cadell was saying in the talk a couple of days ago, you know, that the Lacanian idea is that we don't talk because we want to have sex. We have sex because we want to carry on talking. You know, there's this conversation that's going on. And to put it in even more Lacanian terms, it's a sort of enactment of a fantasy structure. You're trying to reenact a fantasy over and over again, and that is always discursive. It's always about your relation, your objectal relationship to somebody. So, you know, in the clinical terms, when you're trying to figure out a symptom, you're basically trying to figure out where you position yourself in relation to the other elements. So, you know, a person who likes to be the person who is always chucked out of the house, or the person who is always kicked to the curb, or the person who's always, you know, these kind of fantasy structures that people look for in their relationships, and they repeat them over and over again, and they get this form of enjoyment from it. And, you know, what porn sort of attempts to do is to give you a quick way to find what that particular structure is. And once you find it, it's like, yeah, that was it. But then is there another way of reinstitching it? So it kind of like kicks in this mechanism, which is insatiable, because you can't actually ever resolve it. It's just a compulsion that is always going to be there. And how do you take that structure and make it into something that's edifying as opposed to devastating, you know? So in that sense, like with the question of explicitness and obscenity and sexual relationships, we can't go back. So how do we go with what we have now and try and make our relationships less awful, if that makes sense?
And when you say there's like with sexuality and its discursiveness, there's also the repetition aspect, which makes it more sexual in a sense. Because Zizek says this, and I think it's the lecture he did like a while back on the four discourses, and he uses the example. It's like imagine I shake your hand, right? That's fine. Like, you know, I shake your hand once, but what if I shake your hand and I kind of redraw back but then I reach for it and continuously shake and then do it again. Then it just starts to get weird. and you have this feeling of being violated in a sense like that.
Exactly. Being the object of somebody else's desire, or, you know, it's a horrible thing. And that's why, you know, sex is so traumatic, you know, and it's not just traumatic for people who've experienced sexual trauma, which of course is horrific, but for everybody, you know, it's traumatic in the sense that it invokes our most sort of intimate forms of enjoyment that we never really had control over in the first place, because they were laid down for us at a stage that we're not able to kind of formulate, because it's always retroactive. You know, we don't sort of become adults and then go, oh, now I'm discovering sexuality and now I realize what it is to be an adult. It's like, no, you kind of like get older and then you retroactively go, oh, okay, so this is why I was like this and this was why I wanted to do that. And you kind of bit by bit recognize certain things. Hopefully, you know, we should hopefully recognize more things about ourselves as we go on. And, you know, those things are, in a sense, they kick in at a point where it's very difficult for us to even locate. Well, of course, you know, and this is why Freud was such a genius, because he basically, you know, opened up people's eyes and minds and whatever to the idea, well, actually, sexuality starts in childhood, and it is impossible to think of the human without this concept. You have to understand the human as a product of sexuality. And as we go on and on about in Lacanian terms, sexuality isn't a particular thing to do with actual human beings having sex. It is just subjectivity itself. So yeah, I mean, it's really important, I think, to always think about the ways in which enjoyment is very problematic for us, and it always will be. And I don't think there is such a thing as thinking about healthy sexual relationships. I mean, of course there is. I mean, within normative terms, of course there is. Of course, you know, mutual respect, etc., etc. But we have to recognize the fact that it's always problematic for everybody. Everybody experiences pain and alienation in these domains, and unless we recognize it, we will always have, you know, exploitation and worse things.
Yeah. I know we should probably finish up here, but I just wanted to expand on something that you just said that really, really struck me, which is, yes, we don't have any say over the way we enjoy. That is formed for us traumatically. Wouldn't you say that the problem with maybe like the whole sex positivity movement is that it's premised on this notion that, you know, enjoyment can be completely self-determined and sort of self-transparent, and we can know exactly what we enjoy in terms of, like, as if we could just you know, like, shed a light on the algorithm of our own enjoyment, and that wouldn't be problematic.
I mean, exactly. You know, that's the whole stakes of psychoanalysis, is that these questions are inherently impossible to know, and they are informing everything that we do, and most of them are occluded questions. We can't transparently understand our motivations for a lot of things. So yes, you know, sex positivity, of course, you know, but it has its good intentions, but how can we possibly all simply follow through on our desire and it to not be painful and difficult and problematic and potentially bad for other people. You know, unfortunately, lots of people's desires are not matching with either their partners or, you know, with the wider world. More importantly, as we can see from the fact that there is so much violence against women. You know, that if sex positivity would work, then why would women still be raped and murdered all the time? You know, like, clearly there is something very wrong with the idea that all you need to do is just be open and honest and everything will be fine. It's like, well, actually, it's much more complicated than that, and it's never a simple ABC equals happy time. So yeah, it's so complicated, and we've gone into so many other directions other than the actual AI, but which is good, because I think that this is, you know, this is more towards my other book as well. And thank you, because you've helped me to think about lots of these other questions that I'm writing at the moment. So that was really useful to talk to you guys.
Would you like to quickly, I know you already did, but plug the book you're writing? Is there anything else you'd like to add about it?
Well, it's called Patai Politics, and it's published with Bloomsbury, hopefully by the end of this year. So it's just sort of coming together at the moment. And yeah, so it's essentially looking at this sort of new paradigm that I'm trying to sort of come to terms with, which builds on Foucault's biopolitics, of course, and Membe's necropolitics, but developing this idea of a politics of suffering and jouissance in the Lacanian key, but more than the Lacanian key, just generally drawing on all these other thinkers that I engage with, including Baudrillard and Bataille and Lyotard and people like that. So yeah, it's sort of it's a thesis, but it's more like a collection of essays building up to a sort of paradigm, as it were. So yeah.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah, definitely looking forward to read that one.
Thank you.
A bunch of good thinkers, especially Lyotard. I feel like Lyotard doesn't get talked about enough. Wow.
Oh yeah, definitely. Very interesting.
All right, is this the quilting point?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Great conversation.
Plenty of memes to come after this now.
Yay.
Get ready.
I'm
And
looking forward.
Yeah.
is on it.